Welcome to Ski Resort Builder, where the landscape is the canvas and the player can design their dream ski pistes, lifts and resort layouts. The core game will be a single-player creative sandbox with elements of economic management and optimization. Let's watch the end-to-end process of building a lift and a piste. This overlay is telling us the gradient of the slope at any point, using the standard ski resort system of black for steepest and green for shallowest slope. We're going to build ourselves a chairlift first, so bring the build menu up and choose Lifty McLift Face. We'll build from the edge of the shallow area down here up to the shallower area the other side of this red and black steep section. Some big inspirations for us are Transport Tycoon and Roller Coaster Tycoon. And as in those games, one of the key resources that the player is exploiting is the space in their sandbox, how they choose to use it. Every feature that you build has the opportunity cost of some other feature that you can't build in that location. Another big inspiration is automation sims like Satisfactory, where often your opponent is merely a past version of yourself. A key challenge, both aesthetically and in game terms, is to create a balanced flow of resources around your machine. Here, the main flow that you're balancing is your guests around your resort. So a successful resort will need to balance the lift and piste connections in order to avoid any popular areas becoming bottlenecks. For example, if a single lift is the only way to access several different pistes, or conversely, if there are several pistes which all meet at a single isolated lift. So why Unreal Engine for this project? Many features in Unreal Engine are very useful for a small indie studio, but I want to focus on three that particularly apply to this kind of creative sandbox simulation. They are the Mass Entity plugin, the Nanite Virtualized Geometry, and the PCG World Building tools. All three of these are critical for the scale that we want to build an immersive mountainside resort simulation. Mass Entity will allow us to simulate and render the interactions and movements of thousands of guests and vehicles across the mountains. Nanite unlocks a smooth interpolation between the extremes of scale, where we can zoom right into a few guests boarding a lift, or right out to this perspective where we're overlooking several hundred meters of landscape. And the PCG tools make it feasible to decorate these hundreds of meters of landscape with only a tiny team of developers. Declarative rule sets for content placement can be applied across many similar environmental instances. We're done building, so let's turn the overlay off and admire our ski resort in the glorious winter sunshine. Still looking rather empty though, without any guests in the resort. And now we have a chairlift running, we're also steadily leaking cash heavily into the red already. So let's build some accommodation for our guests to stay in. Bring up the build menu and choose the accommodation placeholder and plonk one of these down somewhere near the lift. All the entity spawning you're seeing here is taking place dynamically from data that the player is creating. Some of the player actions required here for building things are ripe for quality of life improvements, but it's working for now. Put that onto the accommodation, and then this one here for joining it to the piste, and then out come the little guests. You can see we now have 8 people booking holidays in the resort, so they're going to make a beeline for the chairlift. Let's reward ourselves with a closer look at the guests boarding the lift we've just built. There's a fair bit of janky detail with clipping and so on, but the mechanics are in place. The guests ski up to the lift, they queue, and then they teleport onto the chair to ride standing defiantly all the way up the mountainside, just like everyone does. Isn't that what they do in your ski resort? We're going to use some of the debug settings here to fast forward and scale up this resort a little bit. In terms of creating an immersive, compelling narrative in the game, one of the core challenges is the scale of a mountainside resort. We can put this in perspective by considering a real-life ski resort. So La Plagne in the French Alps sees about 2.5 million guests each year across a ski season that's around about 20 weeks long. The guests obviously aren't uniformly distributed, so let's take a ballpark and say très haute saison, which is the highest of the 4 ratings used by the industry, is maybe 250,000 guests each week. Running a raw simulation on 250,000 guests would be a rather outlandish goal and unnecessary for a number of reasons. The main 2 reasons are: 1, a player is never going to be able to emotionally connect with 250,000 people. That's not meaningful. They don't need to see the data for that. And the second one is that you can create the feeling that we need of intensity and busyness long before you get to 250,000 guests in a simulation. 10,000 guests is already carnage on screen. And as you can see from this very rough demo, that's achievable using the mass entity system. So that's going to remain our cap on the number of runtime entities that we will ever try and simulate. Although the pathfinding is extremely basic in this prototype, you can see that as the resort becomes more ordered, the saturation of the piece is already well established. So we may be able to have an effective visual representation with quite a bit below 10,000 guests visible at one time. So back to the more advanced prototype, and we'll reload the resort we were just building. In this prototype, we are no longer spawning all the entities up front. We are doing it dynamically in accordance with the accommodation units that we've got and the pistes and so on that make the resort more or less attractive for sales. These are once again debug settings, so you'll see the guests surging forth in a way that the player wouldn't be subjected to in an actual game situation. It's worth acknowledging as well that the guests won't be the only entities mass needs to handle, as we also have chairs on the chairlifts and other vehicles. Pretty much anything that moves is likely to be an entity in order to keep all of that as lightweight as possible. So a nominal budget of 10,000 entities will be fairly easy to spend once we include chairs and gondolas as well as guests. The resort continues to get busier, and if we check, there's now 4,200 guests and counting waiting for this chairlift. The frame rate is still hovering around 70 frames per second, so that's pretty tolerable. So there we have it. That's the first look at working title Ski Resort Builder, brought to you by Shipborn Software Solutions.